Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the Panenka podcast. Today, I'm joined here by Louise, and Kathrin, and today we've got a special episode for you. Today, we're going to be talking about women's football for the first time. Hope you're all enjoying about that. We have our two experts on women's football here to help to guide us through it. And we're going to start with the Women's Champions League, which I believe starts quite soon. Could you talk us through what's going on in the Women's Champions League right now?
Yes, so they've decided to finish the league, and they've started on the 21st. It's going to be a week-long tournament instead of the sort of normal spreading out that they do. They're just going to do one-leg games for each of the teams. So they decided they wanted to get it finished after COVID. So they're at the quarter-final stage. The teams left are Arsenal, Glasgow City, Lyon, Atletico Madrid, Barcelona, PSG, Bayern Munich and Wolfsburg. So they're the remaining 8 teams. So they'll do a quarter-final game, a couple of days later, semi-final, and then the final just to get it finished.
Yeah. So both of you, which team do you think are going to win the Champions League? Because obviously Lyon are the dominant force in women's football. But do you think any other team could take the Champions League this year?
I think all of the teams that are left are very, very good teams, and I think that the Atletico Madrid Barcelona game will be very tight. Both teams are very good, and I also think that Lyon would potentially win it again. It's just their dominance in the women's league has been outstanding, and their players are just amazing.
Yeah, I think a lot of Lyon players were rumoured to be leaving sort of at the end of the season because they didn't know what was going to be happening with the Champions League. But because they decided to finish it, all of the players have stayed on short-term contracts, meaning that their team is by far the best team in terms of player talent left in the competition now.
So who do you think will be joining Lyon in the Champions League? Because I basically just guessed that Lyon will probably be in the Champions League final, but who do you think would be joining them, second best?
I think Wolfsburg have been in the final a couple of times, and Barcelona have been in the final a couple of times. And I think both of those, they've been playing well in their seasons, sort of league-wise. So I think either of those teams, I think, could be in the final as well.
Players with Pernille Harder and all the other players. She was my player of the season in Europe, and she's just had such a good season, and I think it will be a good final despite whichever team gets in the end.
Yeah, so that's what we know about the Women's Champions League. I mean, to be brutally honest, me and Louis can't really talk about it.
No,
this is sort of like our...
This is a learning curve for both of us.
Yeah, we're being brought into women's football with this. But yeah, next we're going to look at something we may be a little bit more comfortable with, which is the Women's Super League, which is the top league in England. And I believe Chelsea have won the league. Would you like to take us through the Women's Super League, and praying that you tell me that Everton actually have a decent team?
Yeah, so the league was decided on PPG in the end. So when the season actually finished, Manchester City were at the top of the league, and then sort of based on the points per game, Chelsea, who have been unbeaten but had a game in hand, ended up being crowned champions. So Chelsea and Manchester City were 1 and 2, so they'll take Champions League spots for next year. And then Arsenal were 3rd, and then Reading and Everton, who I know you two will both be interested about hearing about. Reading finished 5th and Everton finished 6th. They both had very good seasons, Everton especially, because the league before they were 1 from the bottom. So yeah, both of those teams had very good seasons.
Yeah, obviously with Arsenal finishing 3rd and stuff, I know Reading have taken 2 long-serving Arsenal players in Danielle Carter, and I've forgotten the other person's name now.
Emma Mitchell.
Yeah.
Emma Mitchell.
Were they important at all in that Arsenal side? Because if they've been there for a long time, obviously Arsenal clearly quite good. Do you think that'll hamper them going into next season?
I think that Danielle Carter really influenced the Arsenal side. She's been in it a long time. She has a lot of authority. They look up to, all the players have come out and said that they look up to her. They know exactly how she likes to play, and the manager supports that. And it's very, they look up to her a lot. So I would think that they would have a lot of influence over their team and the way that, and like what happens in the dressing room.
I think, unfortunately, for both of those players, they struggled quite a lot with injuries, especially in the past season. So Emma Mitchell went to Spurs for the second part of last season just to get some more game time. And I think Dan Carter's also had quite a lot of injuries and hasn't been playing a lot. And I think with the new players that Arsenal are bringing in, they wouldn't be guaranteed very much game time if they stayed. And I know Reading did lose quite a lot of players at the end of the season. So I think that both those players are really good pickups for Reading going into the next season.
They've lost 6 players already and they've signed 3. And it's still, they haven't signed exactly what they need, but I'm sure that there's still plenty of time left in the window.
Yeah, so it's just all about rebuilding, I presume. And then obviously, I'm going to guess that Chelsea and Man City are probably favourites for the title again next season. I think you said before recording the Man City are looking at some of Lyon's players, which obviously Lyon, as we said earlier, are the best team in the women's game. So I think that could propel them to win the league next season over Chelsea.
I think all the top 3 teams have actually done some really good buying in of players, but Manchester City especially. So Lucy Bronze, who has played for them before, is looking at going back, and Alex Greenwood's looking at going back. But there's also a couple of US women's national team players that are sort of in talks to be going on short-term loans to Manchester City. So Samantha Mewis and Rose Lavelle, sort of while they have no league in America. So I think Manchester City have definitely got very good intentions. So they've also got will be having a new manager for the new after Nick Cushing left, and definitely looking at pushing back up in the Champions League and back to league titles.
Yeah, Manchester City have done quite well in keeping a lot of their players. They've only 2 players have actually left. One's gone out on loan, South Korean International League on men, and Tessa Willard has left. But then she was a forward, and they've just brought in Chloe Kelly from Everton, who did very well last season. She was in contention for the Golden Boot. She scored 9 goals last season, so that's a very good signing for them.
Yeah, and just while you... Oh, sorry, you go, Louis.
I was going to say, so who do you think will win the league next season?
I want to say Arsenal as an Arsenal fan, but in all honesty, I can see Manchester City doing it.
Yeah, I agree. I think Manchester City, with the people that they've managed to retain, and especially with this current situation in the pandemic, lots of teams are losing a lot of players. But the fact that they've only had 2 players leave is extraordinary. So I think they're going to win.
Yeah, and just before we leave the top league in England, I just want to go over the Golden Boot for a second. At some of these, I've just got to look here, and some of these ridiculous stat lines that people have got. You've got Vivian Miedema, I believe that's how you pronounce her name, for Arsenal's women, and 2 specifically, her and Pauline Bremer are 2 names that have stuck out instantly. Especially Pauline Bremer, who's only played 577 minutes of football and has 10 goals. So is she a new signing, or is she someone who broke out into the team? Because it seems like she's had an incredible, what looks, especially since she's played half the minutes that people like Chloe Kelly, Beth England and Miedema have played, and she's up there challenging for the Golden Boot.
Yeah. So she is at Manchester City. So at the beginning of last season, they signed Ellen White from Birmingham, but she was injured when she came to the club. So Pauline Bremer sort of stepped in the forward role and got more minutes. So beforehand, she'd not played very often for the club. She'd been at Manchester City for a while, but she'd not really got the minutes. And so she sort of managed to break into the team last season and just performed very well and then kept getting starting spots. I believe she might also be a player that has left Manchester City as well, unfortunately for them.
Yeah, so just quickly before we head out of the WSL and go to the Championship, favourites for relegation for next season? Obviously, Aston Villa came up, so I don't know. Do you think they have enough to stay up? Who do you think is just going to go down?
I think Birmingham or Bristol City are really going to struggle.
Yeah,
Both already struggled in the season we've just had. Birmingham especially have had a lot of players leave and have not brought in very many players at all. I think Aston Villa will do well.
They've only scored 5 goals in all of the games, and they average 0.38 goals per game, and they conceded 1.77 per game. So it's just like that stat just gives you a bit of an idea. Whereas I feel like Bristol did struggle, but they scored more goals than Birmingham did, and I feel like they haven't lost as many players as Birmingham, but they've obviously have in their squad as well. So I feel like it could just be Birmingham.
Yeah, so it seems like that's where we're going to... well, actually, we'll do one more thing before we draw a line on this. Who do you both think is the best player in the English league?
Oh, good question.
Vivian Miedema, no doubt.
Yeah, I believe, what is it here? 22 goal contributions in the, it's like 14, 15 games Arsenal have played.
14.
In the winter transfer window that we've just had, Chelsea did sign Australian captain Sam Kerr.
Yeah.
When she was playing in the American League, she won the Golden Boot in the American League and in the Australian Women's League back-to-back for 2 years running. So I think when she gets a full season under her, when she starts like a full season, I think she will do extremely well. And Bethany England for Chelsea as well.
There are a lot of young players that are coming through which play for England, and they're going to do well when they get the minutes. Like Chloe Kelly is very good, and she was up there for the Golden Boot as well.
But at the moment, definitely Viv Miedema.
Yeah, that's from the stat that Callum read out. That seems very obvious. But we'll just quickly go down to the Championship, the second division of women's football. Obviously, Liverpool just got relegated. Who do you think will be pushing to come back up?
I think Liverpool could actually be pushing to come straight back up. But aside from that, Sheffield United and Durham have both consistently performed well in the Championship for the past few seasons. So I think either of them, providing they manage to perform well, I believe both of them have retained nearly all of their squad from last season. I think both of those could be pushing for promotion.
Like you said, they've been very consistent. They both only lost 2 games each. So I think Sheffield United and Durham could be favourites to come up.
All right.
Yeah, no.
You can go.
Just to talk about, because we didn't mention it for the last one, technically, even though the league was ended early, Chelsea went invincible, and we have had another situation of that in the Championship with Aston Villa. Do you think Aston Villa could have retained that invincible moniker, or do you think they would have lost in the remaining games that they had?
I think they could have. I think both Chelsea and Aston Villa, I think, would have gone the whole season unbeaten based on how they were playing. And the teams, especially Chelsea, the teams they had left to play, I think both could easily have.
Yeah, I agree. Sheffield Villa would have gone unbeaten. It's just, as Louise said, the teams they had left to beat, they weren't quite at the same level, and I feel like they would have just walked through right into the FAWSL unbeaten.
Yeah, and just like a weird question, like I'm looking at the women's league here, and there are the London City Lionesses and the London Bees. Are the London Bees the Brentford women's team, or is that a completely separate team? Because it's like, I know Brentford are, I believe Brentford are in London, or if not, I've just made myself look stupid.
Yeah, they're in London. Central London.
They
They're
are
affiliated with Barnet.
Yeah, so London Bees are Barnet. They play at the Hive.
Oh yeah, Barnet.
Which is also where Tottenham Hotspur's women play.
Oh.
Both women's teams play at the same stadium, and the London City Lionesses were Millwall.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right.
And they got rebranded at the start of last season and got a big sponsorship with Nike.
Right.
So it was Nike. I know Nike put a lot of money in, and they sort of made the new London team. They were all fully professional players at London City Lionesses.
I was going to say, why?
Championship.
I'll say why. So why the name? So why are they not called like Millwall something or Barnet something? They're just.
I mean, I can answer the Millwall one for you.
Oh, go on then.
I don't think Nike could want to give a big sponsorship to Millwall, especially with the reputation that Millwall have.
Yeah, so Millwall. So even though London City Lionesses took over, Millwall do still have their own women's team, but they are maybe tier 5, I think, now.
Yeah. So just another question. Like, you look at the men's league table. Is there anyone in like the men's league that are like the complete polar opposite in the women's league? Like, is there a Premier League women's team that is just like completely awful
In like the men's game.
Liverpool.
Yeah.
If you think that their men's team have just league champions, and how well they did, and then look at the fact that their women's team didn't win a game and have been relegated.
They didn't win a game.
They won one. I think Liverpool's women's team won one. I think they beat Bristol City maybe 1-0.
They've only, I'm pretty sure, they only scored like 5 goals.
Yeah, so if you look at the difference between those two teams that are the same club essentially, but
they just don't have
goal
the same.
Is massive.
I was going to say, would you say the Women's Super League is getting more or less competitive then? Because obviously, when you say like Chelsea and Man City are like two of the best teams, and you see Liverpool are only winning 1 game, whereas in the men's game you don't really see that. You see like the bottom teams winning a couple of games, and then like the top teams losing a couple. Would you say the women's game's getting less competitive in terms of leagues or more?
No, I feel like it's getting more competitive. Like there's a lot. Okay, you have the few. I think there's like the 3 teams that don't do too well but there's still like the teams that can do really well. Like West Ham are very big in the women's league, and same with Reading are really big, and I think it's very competitive. There's like 7 teams that are usually could go for it if they wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like we're getting a repeat of real life here with or what happened in the men's game with Manchester City. With do you think it's going to take the same path of like when it first happened in the men's game? Man City sort of like basically in the 2010s completely took over men's football, and the only teams that really stopped them were Chelsea, ironically. Do you think Man City being able to get all this talent, maybe in from Lyon, like Alec Greenwood and stuff like that, may repeat what happened in the men's game of Man City just dominating and completely taking over the WSL?
I think they could, again, with the talent they're bringing in. I know when Manchester City's women's team formed in the setup it's in now, they won everything. They won cups and the league for maybe the first 2 seasons, and then the other teams sort of started to match them. But I think it's definitely, now Manchester United are also in the Super League, it's definitely a 4-horse race at the top, I would say. And now the middle of the table is definitely the most competitive. So that's sort of where West Ham, Spurs, Reading, Everton, those sort of teams are. So those are the teams that have the ability to take points off the top teams but also very comfortably win over the teams that are below them.
Okay, so I mean, I don't have any more questions on the England leagues anyway. Callum, do you have any more questions?
I do have one. I want to ask, how do you think Aston Villa will do coming up? Because I'm just here on the top scorers, and this is a compliment to Sheffield as well. The top 5 scorers are all from Sheffield or Aston Villa. Do you think Aston Villa could come up and maybe do something similar to, like, maybe not like a Leicester, but they could come up and instantly, you know, after maybe 1 or 2 seasons, jump towards the top of the league? Because it seems like they absolutely dominated the Women's Championship.
Yeah, it sounds like they definitely have the momentum.
I think they definitely could do well. I think they will definitely be pushing mid-table this season, I would say.
I would put them in, like you said, like the Spurs and the Reading. I feel like they could definitely challenge mid-table and be competitive.
Yeah, it's just because if I'm correct, Man United came up this last season, didn't they?
Yes.
And they've instantly jumped straight into 4th place. So it seems like, especially in the Championship, that unlike the actual Premier League, you know, the one exception being teams like Wolves and Sheffield United, you know, teams can come up and instantly compete in the big league with these teams and, you know, even maybe take points from the top. You know, would you say that makes it more exciting that teams can come up from the Championship and, you know, there's that element of surprises? You never know how well these teams are actually going to do in the Super League.
Definitely. I would say it can be really unpredictable, especially with new teams coming up or teams that are at the bottom. Sometimes they can take points off teams that you would never sort of expect them to, and it always makes it, I think, it is competitive. I know some of the teams don't seem like they've done so well and have not won many games, but there is the ability for teams to sort of take points off the big teams when you might never expect. So I think teams like Aston Villa and Spurs and Manchester United, who both came up last season, they've both done well. But I also think that's credit to the setup at the clubs and the fact that they've managed to retain a lot of their players that they brought up with them from the Championship. So they've sort of grown their teams instead of just rebuilding their teams with a load of new players that they've brought in.
I think it definitely makes it very exciting, especially as you said, with like the Man United, and I feel like Sheffield United, if they come up next season, they could challenge. It's very unpredictable, like you said. It's just there's teams that you don't think could take points, as you said. Like Everton did well last season in the mid-table. Spurs did well last season in the mid-table. Like Reading do really well. West Ham do really well. There's just so many good teams. And it just makes it really exciting.
Okay, then. So, unless you have any more, do you have any last questions, Callum, before we head into?
And it's about the Championship. You mentioned London City Lionesses having this big sponsorship with Nike. Do you really think this influx of money that may come into this, you know, this Championship team could help them join the contention with teams like Sheffield, Durham, and Liverpool next year?
It's actually quite interesting because when they were formed, and there was this whole big sponsorship with Nike, and I know they bought in a lot of players, like a couple of players that were at like Championship teams before, moved there with the prospect of all this thing, and they didn't actually do that well. Like, I don't think they did as well as they were expected to do, and I know now that they no longer have that deal with Nike after one season. And I think they had 3 managers last season. So I actually don't know if money that was brought in did do them any favours, because they didn't in the end.
But then it comes down to the setup and like the scouts and everything. That's the club setup, and how if they brought in all those players, they didn't bring in the right players and what was needed to strengthen the side.
I think they had money because they were professional. They had money to buy in players that were good, but I think the players that they bought, despite the fact they were good in their own right, it just didn't work for the team, which I think is why they didn't potentially do as well as I think they were expected to.
Yeah, one last question is, It does seem like the women's game relies a lot more on. This is just something that pops into my head that I wanted to ask. Relies a lot more on scouting than the leagues like the Premier League, which is mainly based off transfer windows. And is that why you see teams like Chelsea and Man City at the top as then teams that are known to have, the huge scouting systems that work all across the globe? Do you think the scouting system is probably the most important part of getting some good players in women's football?
I personally think it is. Like with talent identification and everything, there's a different, each FA in every country has a different setup. Like I know in France that Paris Saint-Germain have an academy in Qatar, and they scout a lot of the players from Qatar that play in the leagues, and that they end up going and they end up offering them like scholarships to go and play. And I feel like Manchester City and Chelsea have the big academies, and I think I read something about Manchester City were looking at maybe having an abroad academy, and their scouts are very good with this sort of thing. They can see the potential in certain players, which is just phenomenal. Some of the players that they've scouted are excellent.
Right, so I think Callum is now finally out of questions. I think he's burnt himself out now. So we're going to head into the England national team, but the first question I just want to ask is, do you think the England national team has had a massive impact on women's football in England as a whole?
I think definitely in terms of inspiring girls into the sport, how accessible it is, how accessible the leagues are, but also the women's team is to watch, and how much they do for the game. It's definitely helped, and especially coming off the back of the last World Cup, and how, I mean, they didn't do as well as they have before, but how much it was watched by, because if you think about the fact that the first game after the World Cup, which was held at Wembley Stadium, had 77,000 people at it.
And you have more, I think there was a stat that I read that there's now more people watching the women's international friendlies than the men's international friendlies.
So even though they did lose the game, it was against Germany, and but 77,000 people packed Wembley Stadium to watch the England women's team, which a few years ago would never have happened. They were getting maybe 5,000, 10,000 to watch their friendly games, and it was just.
Yeah, it's just something I've read here. It says it's a BBC Sport article. It's that for the Women's World Cup, it was a record audience of 28.1 million that watched BBC's coverage of it. That's a lot of people. I think that rivals a lot of men's league football, and I think it actually blows quite a lot of men's league football out of the water. I couldn't tell you the actual men's World Cup numbers to save my life, but compared to like league football, even Premier League, that probably is quite competitive with it. How do you think getting that huge audience of 28 million people watching and clearly enjoying it, because a lot of them apparently were repeat viewers? How do you think that's going to impact the women's international scene in general going into the next Euros and the next World Cup?
I think that the international stage it's very dominated by the US team. However, a lot of people seem to forget that the German women's team actually are really good, and they've dominated before the US women's team. And I feel that England, especially now that there's a lot more youth coming into it, there's a lot more youth players that play at like under 23 level, under 18 level are coming into it, and they're like Maya Leticia, Katie Robinson, like this, their link up is gonna help England definitely in the next World Cup.
I think I liked how accessible the last World Cup was to watch. So every game was on BBC, either on the red button or on the TV. And with it being France, there was only a 1 hour time difference. And also in terms of fans going to the World Cup, it was, so for example, I went to Nice to the first game against Scotland, and the amount of people that had travelled, because England doesn't take any time at all to get to France, if you think about it, the amount of fans that had travelled out to watch the game is, I think, something that is a lot more than any would have before. And I know people that travelled round France to watch, and they watched every England game. They followed them to every game, and that's the same with every team. I think if you look at the Netherlands women's team, their Orange Wall, as it's called, the fans in their thousands travel to every single game, regardless of where it is. And as the same with the sort of the filling the stadiums. A few years ago, that would never have happened.
Yeah, I just want you to answer as well. How do you think the pressure will build up on? Because a lot of these, especially if these England teams are about to have like a youth intake, how do you think these younger players are going to react from going to play in front of maybe like a few hundred people to a packed full stadium of maybe like 40 to 50,000 people? Do you think that do you think that's probably had quite an impact on a lot of women's players, or do you think they reacted to it quite well? Because when I watched the England team play, I think they did react to the pressure quite well. To say it's such a huge jump to play in front of maybe 1,000 people on a good day compared to packed stadiums in France.
I think the youth will definitely embrace it a lot more, because you're also getting like I'm pretty sure the under 17 World Cup got a lot of people going out as well. That was at this like after the 2019 one, and I feel like they will embrace it, but there will be some players that certainly do not like it, and it will affect some of them. But I feel like it will affect most of them in a positive way, knowing that they have like the backing.
Especially a lot of the youth England players are currently in the college system out in America, and they're playing so they're like scholarship athletes out at American universities, and I know that they get quite big. I know that they get big crowds watching college women's football out in America
as well.
So I think that the youth that, especially in the World Cup, a lot. I think there was maybe 8 or 9 players in the squad who had never played in a World Cup before. The younger players, and I think they all did remarkably well. I'd even go as far to say some of them performed better than the older players in the squad, I would say.
Yeah, because if I'm correct, I believe the women's football league over in America copies this similar system to, like, I don't know if I'm right here, this is yet again me Googling things mid-podcast, but it seems that they do a similar thing to like the NFL and the NBA, where a lot of their players come through the typical American draft system, where they watch how they perform in college, and then that dictates how they come in, how much they get, kind of like the attention they get. You watch it a lot more. Is there that similar where maybe there's that one athlete that dominates in college and they get quite a lot of hype? Because, for example, in basketball, you'll have someone who, has millions of people watching the clips on, YouTube when they're in college. Is there a similar impact in that when it comes to women's football over there?
They do a draft. So they do so it's the NWSL in America, and they do a college draft. And you can enter the draft if you've been at the colleges, and then there's like a ranking system of if the teams get to pick you, and that is how a lot of the youth players, or that is how at the beginning of the season a lot of the teams get their players through the college draft, and then they do sign players from elsewhere. But mainly it is through the college draft. So yeah, so there are players that go in, and they might already be, say, really well known in the sort of college system, and they're pegged to go to really good clubs. And that's like how they bring their players in.
I think the scouting system in America is like unbelievable. I know that I have girls that I've played with here that have been offered college scholarships in America, and they've I think one of my friends is going to UCLA, and she's going to get to go, and I think there's talk of her joining Houston Dash at some point. Like, she's really good, and their scouting system is just unbelievable.
Yeah, I also know a girl who played for Yeovil, and she's going over there. Like a lot of players, even now. So, for example, Rachel Daly, who's England international and captain of the Houston Dash, she went through the American college system, got drafted into a team, and went from there. So that is how a lot of the players sort of get into the American leagues.
Yeah, so clearly America are very dominant. But do you think that there in the near future that England may get towards that level, or just America at the moment that dominant that like Leon in club football, that there's just no one really getting near them?
I think at the moment with the US women's team, as I think Phil Neville actually said, is they're a lot fitter. They got a lot more game time, and the way that they play in their teams reflects how they play. They play the same system in the US national team, and I think it'll take England a while, but I think they could get there. It's just the fitness levels need to be better, and there's a lot of sports science going on in America that's only just started now in England. So I think they could get there, but it'll be a little bit.
I think there are a few teams, especially the likes of Germany and France, who will match the USA a lot quicker than England will, just due to the look of their international teams and how they've been playing at the moment.
Okay, so well, one thing that would help England at the moment anyway is if they had a manager that was committed. Obviously, they had Phil Neville, who was meant to leave after the Euros and the Olympics, but obviously with everything that's going on, that's been pushed back. So apparently he's meant to be taking over the September camp, but obviously England have been linked with former US manager Jill Ellis, but apparently she wants too much money. So it seems a bit in free fall at the moment.
Yeah, I think from what I've read and what we've discussed previously for the podcast is that Jill Ellis wants the FA to match what she was getting from US Soccer, which is $500,000 or something. And if you think about how much money they've probably lost due to COVID, it's very unlikely that they would have that sort of money to match them. But then there haven't been too many other names linked with the job that would realistically take it. So, for example, like when Phil Neville took over, he had never had anything to do with the women's game before. And I think a lot of people are worried that a similar thing is going to happen, sort of to take over. Which, I mean, I don't know who else they've sort of talked about, but I know a couple of WSL managers, for example, Casey Stoney and Emma Hayes, have both also their names have also been thrown around in the mix for the England position.
Yeah.
So
I don't, like you said, it's whether they'll leave their clubs, especially as they're doing so well with their own clubs that they may not want to leave as they still haven't reached benchmarks they personally want to reach. So,
yeah,
it will be interesting.
I was going to say, so obviously they finished, I think, semi-finals of the last World Cup. That they got far, but yeah. So I think England clearly they're clearly quite decent. You said earlier they finished third, didn't they?
They finished third in 2015 and they finished fourth 2019.
Yeah, so they're clearly one of the better women's teams. So it's nice to see that the England women's team is doing quite well, because obviously the men's more recently has been getting better, but I think it's nice to see the women's team are consistently one of the best national teams by the sounds of things in the country. But yeah, so obviously, when's the next World Cup? 2022, I think it was, wasn't it? No, the Euros.
So the Euros will be 2022, and that is in England. So that's quite an incentive. I think it's quite an incentive for the FA and the England team to sort of have sorted themselves out by then.
and there's a lot of home advantage in the women's game. A lot. I can't remember. I read a stat, and it's like the women's Germany win a lot when the World Cup was held in Germany. I think Germany won. So home advantage is certainly something that is available in the women's World Cup.
Yeah, it sounds like, because obviously America is so dominant, so in the Euros, obviously they're not going to be there. So maybe England could win the Euros. That would probably do a lot for the game as well. But I don't know. I'm not sure. But if they're like third or fourth best, and obviously if America's not in it, then to me it seems like they could go pretty far in that competition.
Yeah, I agree. I think they could go far. However, I do think that it will be between either Germany or the Netherlands to actually win the Euros.
Yeah, the Netherlands, they won the 2017 Euros. They beat Denmark in the final, and it was the first time either of those teams had ever got to a major final. And obviously now, since then, the Netherlands were in the final of the World Cup last year. And they have players like Vivian Miedema and Daniel van der Donken, players that are playing in the WSL. They could... I would like to see England do well, though, especially with it being a home Euros. And I'd also like to see Wales and Scotland potentially get in, because neither of them have ever got... Well, Scotland were in the World Cup last year, but...
Yeah, this sounds like the men's game in terms of England. They're a lot better than Scotland and Wales and all the other home nations. Because it doesn't sound like they're too great if you're just talking about them getting in, let alone pushing higher up further through the tournament.
Yeah, Wales have never got to a major tournament, but Scotland did get to their first ever Women's World Cup last summer, and only got to the far as the group stage. Didn't get any further.
Yeah, that sounds similar to what me and Callum know anyway. So Cam, do you have any other questions about the England national team? Or I think in my head we've got two more topics.
You've done this again, because I've got like 2 or 3. But first of all, it's not really a question, but it's to touch back up on what we spoke about earlier. It kind of shows how important the academy system is, because if you look at the 2 teams that you said were in the final, the Netherlands and Denmark, quite funny that we were talking about scouting systems when Copenhagen and Ajax have 2 of the best scouting systems in world football. It kind of shows like what you were talking about earlier of how important scouting is in women's football, bringing in that talent through your own country. Because I am guessing that the national teams probably do use teams like Ajax and Copenhagen scouts to find this young talent. And, it's clearly working, because it seems like the places that have the better scouting networks do well in the international tournaments.
The Netherlands especially have a very good youth setup. So a very good system of bringing players through from a young age up to the senior team. So they especially have got a very, very good system of that.
Yeah, and just my last question is to touch back up on Phil Neville. Is how do you feel about like you said, this could happen again? What are your 2 opinion on a manager? I think this will probably be the last question that we do. But what do you think is the opinion on managers using the women's game as a stepping stone, especially since it looks like it's a possibility that Phil Neville could just jump straight into the Salford job now that he's got a little bit of experience? What's your opinion on maybe like former England legends maybe stepping into women's football just to get a job in the men's game?
Well, I don't like it. I certainly don't like it, but I think that it is a way to get the jobs. However, there's a lot more women's coaches coming through now, and they're the ones that should be getting the opportunities rather than the bigger names, especially if they've had no experience in women's management.
It sort of feels a little bit like he never really respected the job, like for as big as the job was, because managing an England team, a national team, is a very big is a very big deal, and I think it felt a little bit. So when he was appointed, people were very dubious about it anyway because he'd never done anything in the women's game, and I think when these comments came out about it being a stepping stone, I think it really upset a lot of people that are big fans of the women's game. It did sort of feel like a little bit like he wasn't really respecting the position that he'd had.
And if you want to like put it into a bit of context, it's like Gareth Southgate saying that he doesn't want to, he's only using it to go manage like Barcelona or something. Like, it's just crazy.
Yeah, especially with obviously anything about equal rights and stuff like that, saying that you're using a woman's job to be a stepping stone for a men's is, I don't know. I don't know. I don't get the thinking behind
Especially
that.
when it's somewhat as big as England as well. Like, it doesn't really matter if it's men or women's football. It's still managing an England national team. It's a big deal. Don't get me wrong. I'd understand if Phil Neville was like, oh, it's a stepping stone because he'd been offered the men's England job or something. But if you go, I'm sorry, but if you're going to go to Salford City or Rochdale, then I honestly think it's a step down, a huge step down as well from a national team position.
So speaking of the equal pay, the equal rights, sorry, we're going to go into one of the biggest debates in women's football ever, probably. Equal pay, with Megan Rapinoe and the US national team wanting equal pay. Obviously, it sounds like from what you said earlier that the women's game is quite big over there. Maybe not as big as the men's, as the men's is developing in America. So from that standpoint, you can kind of understand what they mean. But in general, do you think women should have equal pay to men at this moment in time?
So I think if you were talking about the talent of the game, I think that they should be paid the same. They're playing exactly the same game at the end of the day, so why shouldn't they? But if you think about football as a business and the fact that it has to make money and the money that it makes around the world, the women's game in no way matches the sort of money, especially in England with like the Super League and the Premier League, and it in no way matches the money that it brings in. And as I said, it is a business. So countries that football isn't the biggest sport, for example Australia and New Zealand, they pay their women's and their men's team the same, but it isn't a big sport there. And if you look at the US with Megan Rapinoe and what she's saying, is if you look far enough into it, you find out that the women's team do get paid more than the men's team. But what they're saying is because they're more successful and they've played in more tournaments and they win more, but they're saying that on a game-by-game basis, the money that they bring in is less than what
it's like the men get paid by performance. They don't get paid annually, or I can't remember exactly what the term is, but the women's get paid like annually, and they don't have to have had like performances. They could have been out. But whereas the men's team obviously only get paid, okay, if you play, you get paid, and if they have the extra bonuses when they win the tournaments or not. But I agree with what Louise said at the beginning, is if it's based on talent, yes, but with what they're actually saying, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, so I basically agree with that. I just don't think if the women's game ends up getting to the point where it's near like the men's games in terms of revenue and stuff like that, then definitely, but I don't think anytime soon. Callum, your opinion on it? Do you agree?
I think when it comes to internationally, if it keeps bringing in the audience that it's bringing, which of course rivals the men's, then in that case, yes, the women probably should earn as much as the men when it comes to international. But I don't believe in the men's game, they don't get paid for international play, do they? Or I believe it's very performance-based. It's not salary-based. So don't get me wrong, the women should be making the same performance bonuses as the men if they keep bringing in the audiences that they bring in. But for example, when it comes to the WSL, until it draws Premier League level numbers, they can't expect to earn as much as Premier League footballers because it's about income and expenditure. It's not about gender, really.
But yeah, I think that's the rest of the end. I don't think there's anything else we really need to speak about. So yeah, I'll let Cam do the outro, but I just want to give a special mention to Harvey for setting this whole thing up, because obviously he couldn't be here to record today, but I know he really wanted to do it. And he's been watching this episode for a while, so just a quick mention to Harvey, but I'll let Cam do the outro now.
Yeah, anyway, right. So thank you all for watching this episode of the Panenka podcast. Please go follow the Instagram, the Twitter, like the video, subscribe. Follow Louise and Kathrin's pages. They'll be all linked below. And thank you all for watching, and goodbye.
See you later.